Friends, welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It's not difficult for you, but it's nice for me, and we're starting. L'Oreal felt her finish build up. Ah, she sighed at last. She moaned in the guy's ear from above, and he started to accelerate. L'Oreal turned her head to the side, trying to hide from his breathing. Beer and bad cigarettes, ugh. Certainly not an aphrodisiac. She squeezed her eyes shut tightly and just focused on the delicious sensations. They were good, but not good enough to confuse her, at least not yet. Maybe a little later. It didn't help that his foreplay was minimal. She tried to remove the hand that was roughly caressing her and encourage his body to sink lower. That's how her husband Dave learned to satisfy her completely. Not only did he ignore her hand trying to pull his head down, but he also pushed her back onto the bed. Once inside, he grabbed her hair into a knot, effectively stopping her from moving away to breathe. In the struggle that followed, she managed to put her hand on the base of his organ to limit penetration. Thus, having regained the ability to breathe, she focused on making him feel good. Strangely, she wanted to convince him that an older woman had advantages that girls his age didn't have. She braced herself for him to fill her, listening for the obvious signs that he was close to the finish line. She hadn't allowed Dave to have that kind of pleasure in years, but she was willing to make the sacrifice to make sure it would be good for this stranger. L'Oreal was pleasantly surprised when he voluntarily came out. Maneuvering again, the 20-year-old guy. His name was Frank spread her legs wide with his knees and pierced her with his above-average length with a little pressure. On a purely physical level, L'Oreal thought the experience was a bit unfortunate. Then, in the dim light of the switched-off bedside lamp, she looked into his eyes. She liked what she saw. A guy in his early 20s, so turned on by her body that he almost couldn't control himself. For the first time, her brain stopped working long enough to allow her body to respond automatically. She felt her diaphragm contract with a wave of lust and lifted her hips to meet the guy's thrusts. Following the habits of married life, she tried to kiss the guy above her. It was then that the reality of his breathing almost made her descend from a height. She felt her loveliness massaged every time his bone came into contact with hers, causing her to give in to a feeling of intense pleasure. If she were capable of rational thinking, it would sound something like this. This is it? Ah. It was one of the most intense moments of pleasure that L'Oreal could remember. If the guy came right now, she would have improved him to the best in memory. And then he ruined everything. If this guy were Dave, he would know that she likes it when he slowly calms down after she finishes, for half a minute or so, even if he hasn't finished yet, knowing that she will surprise him right after a little rest. A vacation that included him nuzzling her neck and telling her that she was the love of his life. Instead, the guy just kept banging, looking for his own release. Physically, she felt uncomfortable and forced her conscience to attack her soul. She was a liar, and, like 10 minutes ago, she was a multiple liar. All the self-justification that had meant so much to her before the pleasure had now evaporated when she finished. Was this the case last month? Or was she too drunk to notice? Her mind was trying to push away the memories of last month. Last month, the first time she cheated on him. She started the evening with her friends as an absolutely faithful wife of 46 years. A wife who has never even been tempted to go astray. A woman whose husband has gone on another business trip, and a woman who has fallen into a deadly trap of nature. The one who increasingly saw in the mirror the devastating effects of time and 3 children on her face and body, and the one who subconsciously missed the lustful eyes that followed her when she entered the room. There was an almost perfect storm that first night. She knew and understood why Dave had to travel so much. They put everything they had into giving their children the best start in life, including higher education. After analyzing their finances after Laura left home, they realized that Dave would have to spend a difficult 5 years if they wanted a comfortable retirement. It meant traveling, and a lot of traveling. She understood all this and was pleased with her decision. This did not make it easier for her to cope with loneliness and did not reduce the time for introspection. She started dating 3 young single friends after their charity parties. Well, 2 of them were single, and the third was just acting like that. If the rumor mill was right, she was telling her friends, "I like to make love, no more than 6 times a day." One of the girls brought some special cookies to give this evening a boost. Against her better judgment, L'Oreal split her share. This was followed by a quick succession of strong drinks. L'Oreal's vision became blurry. Thus, she could not see that for an hour after entering the bar, she was the only one of the group buying drinks for herself. It was not unusual for her companions to take turns leaving with the guys. She was left alone, stoned on cookies, swaying from alcohol and, in her own opinion, indifferent to everything. The last crisis came when she went to the bar to have another drink and saw herself in the mirror behind the counter. L'Oreal didn't know it, but the simple, unremarkable guy sitting next to her was almost completely discouraged by her. Almost. A cheerful greeting, a few cheap compliments, one glass, and he and L'Oreal got what they wanted. He was driving the car. None of them paid attention to the sticker in the collection behind the counter. It read, "Alcohol that has been helping ugly people make love since 3000 BC. L'Oreal was over the moon. She still had it. The young guy couldn't resist and desperately wanted her. She was too drunk to pay attention to the first short episode when they got to her house, but it revived her sense of worth even in the state in which she was drunk. However, she was completely sober when he used her again in the morning. She hadn't even had time to sweat when he came out a minute later. While he was lying on his back, breathing heavily, L'Oreal went to the shower. When she returned, he was gone. No note, no hasty thanks. Nothing. The value of the entire interlude was shattered, and her ego sank lower than before the start of the entire episode. She was terrified of her own betrayal, not to mention that he hadn't even tried to arrange another meeting. How bad was she that he didn't want a repeat performance? She was also horrified that the guy obviously wasn't even wearing a condom. Pregnancy was still a real risk, and who knows what diseases she might have picked up. Her self-esteem plummeted when she made the shameful journey to pick up her car from the parking lot of the bar. When Dave returned home from that trip, she did the right thing and avoided making love to him until any possible illnesses showed up on blood tests. Then she just sweated until she got her period at the end of the month. The whole episode was emotionally devastating and plunged L'Oreal into temporary insanity. Would she have continued her self-destructive path if she had just accepted the fact that it wasn't her fault that the guy was just a jerk? So on Dave's next trip, she went back to the bar with friends, getting ready. She declined the offered cookies, drank the wine, patted the box with elastic bands in her pocket, and looked around the room like a predator. Defiantly taking off the rings and putting them in her pocket, then unbuttoning a couple of buttons on her blouse in front of her friends, she turned and walked towards her goal. Young, passably pretty, and already smiling the smile of a tipsy. Her ego soared, and she grinned at her companions as she picked up her purse from the table before strutting out with her new stud. She was going to visit him, but he was out of town and lived in the same room with two other players of his rugby team. She was too smart to have a motel bill on her credit card statement, and she didn't want to tempt fate by asking him to rent another room. So she dragged him to her house. Again. He tore off his clothes and hers as they ran up the stairs. And then, well, you know what happened next. L'Oreal wished the guy would hurry up and come in. Then, learning from the previous mistake, she will ask him to join her in the shower to clean up before the second round. It's going to be so good. She could bury thoughts of Dave and his lonely existence in a motel room on the other side of the country until morning. By then, she would have already proved to this guy and to herself what a real woman is still capable of. Oh, yes, in the morning, when he staggers out into the street, every last drop of liquid will be drained from him. She vaguely hoped that the coach wasn't angry at him for losing his strength before the game. He said he was the 8th number of the team, whatever that meant. Oh, God. Come on, L'Oreal thought, not noticing the irony. Young women will kill for a guy who can perform like number 8. Remembering that she should chuckle gratefully, L'Oreal involuntarily thought of her husband, wondering what small gift he would bring her from his last trip. He always brought her something not necessarily expensive, but always caring. Each time, shortly before the wedding, they performed their own little verbal ritual. Accepting the trinket, L'Oreal would say, "Why are you always spoiling me, Dave?" To which he answered unmistakably, "Because you're worth it." Although it was by no means an expectation, Dave's homecoming and caring were usually rewarded with intense lovemaking. Although, now she thought about it, the frequency has dropped in the last couple of years. Does Dave's libido weaken with age? L'Oreal didn't think so. he still proposed to her every second or third night? Or is it her love interest that is weakening and causing her to increasingly reject his advances? The thought of her husband sent a chill of guilt through L'Oreal. After finishing, she finally thought about what she was risking by doing this. The guy pushing into her grinned with pride as he interpreted the tension of her entire body as that she would finish again. L'Oreal relaxed, deciding once and for all that there would be no repetitions after this spectacular session. Then she relaxed even more, deciding that all this would be good for Dave. With her loving selfishness, Dave won't get so many rejections in the future. Sighing, L'Oreal focused on getting her long-delayed date over with faster. She felt increasingly uncomfortable there and hoped that the rugby player would finish soon. The events of the next few minutes were so crowded and full of emotions for L'Oreal that later she had difficulty remembering the exact sequence. The lights suddenly came on in the master bedroom. The first thing L'Oreal noticed was that her lover's eyes were tightly shut. Confused, she turned her head towards the bedroom door and froze, her whole body shrinking. Dave was there. Her dear Dave. She watched as he went to the closet, took off a large suitcase, and put it on her precious antique blanket drawer at the foot of the bed. L'Oreal felt like a surreal spectator, as he didn't even look at her when he did it. Her sudden scream, a few seconds later, brought the young guy above her out of his thoughts, which, if he had been able to formulate them, would have been something like this: "Damn, she's finishing again." His eyes flew open. Then he turned his head and followed the gaze of the terrified woman below him. He saw a guy who he assumed was the husband of a fallen woman. He didn't ask if she was married, and she didn't talk about it. Saw what a vulnerable position he himself was in. Jumped up, jumped out of the L'Oreal and stood face to face with the threat. With his testosterone and adrenaline levels at their peak, his next words were almost an automatic response. "You know, I could make mincemeat out of you." Dave just turned to face the guy, who was half a foot taller, much bigger, and about half his age. "Yes, I suppose you could. But isn't it enough that you used my wife and ruined my marriage without attacking me? Now cover up, you look ridiculous standing like this." Number 8, or Frank, as he was more often called, quickly cooled down under the onslaught of that calm voice and non-aggressive expression. He looked at his slippery, rubber-coated, rapidly deflating erection, saw the guy turn back to the closet and start stuffing clothes from hangers and shelves into a suitcase, and felt very, very stupid. He shyly began to gather up his clothes and put them on, without turning his back on the guy, who was probably in shock and could explode at any moment. L'Oreal just sat there like an ostrich and hid her head under the sheet. She was in severe shock and was minutes away from fainting. It took Frank about a minute to gather enough clothes to be decent. Embarrassed, he muttered, "Sorry, man," and headed for the door. Dave glanced over his shoulder as he continued to pack. "Wait a minute." Frank stopped, lowering his eyes. Dave turned to him. "Look at me." Frank forced himself to obey, overcoming his shame. He saw a man in complete control of himself, whose face expressed not anger, but rather pity. "Are you married?" Frank shook his head. "Well, I hope one day you will meet the love of your life and marry her. One day you'll be on a business trip and you won't be able to reach your wife. When it happens, think about this particular moment." Dave held Frank's gaze, which was filled with absolute shame for the situation. The big man muttered another "sorry" and walked out the door. After glancing at the bed, Dave returned to his things. Stunned, L'Oreal continued to hide under the covers. After a couple of minutes, L'Oreal risked peeking out from under the sheet. A quick glance didn't confirm that Dave was looking at her accusingly. No. Instead, he concentrated on zipping up the second of the two suitcases. That meant he was leaving. What? Without discussion? From the look on his face, he acted like he was packing up when he left the motel room after a week of traveling. It penetrated even L'Oreal's dazed brain like, "It's weird." After watching him ignore her for another half-minute, L'Oreal tried to speak. She opened her mouth. The words were there, ready to be spoken, but nothing came out. It was only when Dave set both suitcases upright and side by side, preparing to leave the room, that extreme desperation forced her to pull herself together. She sat up with difficulty, leaning back against the pillows. She decided not to get in his way to prevent his escape, because that would mean being naked in front of him, and she couldn't guarantee that there weren't any obvious signs of her betrayal on her body. For some reason, it seemed important. It was only when Dave picked up both suitcases and headed for the door that L'Oreal gathered the strength to croak, "Wait." Dave stopped, put down his suitcases, and did something that L'Oreal wouldn't have noticed until a few days or weeks later. He sighed and looked at his watch. L'Oreal studied his face, expecting to see what? Disapproval? Anger? Even rage? Condemnation and devastation? Of course, there was nothing like that. In the heat of passion, L'Oreal couldn't guess what the mind behind that all-too-familiar face was thinking. He was mostly neutral, but with strange hints of other things. Other things that grew in her imagination in the weeks that followed. She could have sworn he looked like he was trying to suppress a smile of pride, a humble look, but that couldn't be true. He stood and looked at her, waiting. "Dave, I am. Please, L'Oreal, don't say that this isn't what it looked like, or that it was just making love, or that it was the first time. If it were possible, my opinion of you would be even worse if you used those tired old cliches. And before you say you're bored with our love life, remember that since we got married, I've been in the same boat as you." Or did you mean that you were afraid of growing old and becoming infertile? Well, I think men are just as worried about their declining productivity as women are about their fading looks and love interest. But that didn't motivate me to have affairs. Maybe you justify this behavior by saying that it is acceptable to me. I think we've had about 1,000 conversations over the years that have told you otherwise. L'Oreal's head was spinning. Dave seemed to be looking into her head and seeing her thoughts between the time they were born, but before they reached her mouth. She knew him. She knew she had to take all the blame on herself and throw herself at his mercy. "Dave, I just don't care, L'Oreal. I know I'm a good guy here. Deep down, I know that I gave our marriage everything I could. I gave you everything I had. Tell me, am I more romantic than any other husband you know? Remember if I missed the opportunity to tell you or show you that I love you." No, it just didn't happen. I suppose some guys might reproach themselves that their best qualities are simply not enough, but not me. We drilled into our children that their best efforts are always good enough, and it would be hypocritical of me to judge myself by a different standard. So, L'Oreal, obviously it wasn't good enough for you, but I did everything I could, and I'm happy with that. This means that all the blame lies with you and your expectations. Goodbye, Lori. L'Oreal sat stunned. Dave picked up the suitcases again and stopped, looking into her eyes with a strange, incomprehensible expression. The moment dragged uncomfortably. It was only when L'Oreal looked down that she heard him walking again. She heard one of the suitcases hit the door jamb lightly, and then it was gone. She knew she had to run after him, but why? What would she say when she caught up with him? He said that was it. That was it. It all happened on Friday evening. L'Oreal may have escaped her initial PTSD, but one by one, all three of her children called to tell her that their father had contacted them and told them everything. Penny, the eldest, and Laura, the youngest, called early on Saturday morning, asked how she was feeling, and calmly made it clear that they were disappointed in her before hanging up. By Sunday afternoon, when Mark, the last of the three, called her, she got out of bed only to answer the call of nature and throw the sheets in the trash. He was much more brutal in expressing his feelings. This proved that she was wrong. She had many more tears. Friday night was completely sleep-deprived, and by Sunday evening she was afraid of the sleep she might snatch. Soon, a certain pattern developed in her dreams. Well, actually nightmares. It all starts with fond memories of her former life with Dave. Maybe it was an anniversary, or just a gift, or a huge bouquet of flowers that Dave brought her for no apparent reason. In her dream, she said, "Dave, why are you spoiling me so much?" He replied, as always, "Because you're worth it, Lori." She looked up, smiled at him, but did not see an answering smile. Instead, there was an expression on his face that she had last seen on his familiar face that fateful night. An expression she still couldn't decipher. This inevitably woke her up, and at this time the memories of her betrayal crashed into her dazed brain. Napping was almost as bad. Half asleep, she will receive a trigger that will bring the injury back. It could have been a grunt that reminded her of Friday night, or a turn of her head towards the bedroom door. Most of the time it was the smell. Imaginary scents of male sweat, stale beer, or love. They were not stopped by a change of bed linen or spraying with air freshener. On Sunday evening, she resigned herself to the inevitable and moved into the spare room, refusing even to enter the master bedroom to use the bathroom. By Monday, she was a wreck. If the phone rang, she looked at it long enough to know if it was Dave. When it wasn't, she ignored him. In a way, she was glad he hadn't called yet. Despite her best efforts, she still couldn't even begin to justify what she had done for herself, let alone him. On Tuesday evening, there was a knock on the door. Knowing that Dave would never knock, she ignored him and returned to her obsession. She almost jumped out of her skin when Sandra, her best friend and charity colleague, entered the bedroom. She took one look at L'Oreal and anxiously walked over to the bed. She explained that she was worried that her friend had not contacted her and came to find the front door unlocked. L'Oreal let it all spill out. It was her turn not to delay the punches. Put all the blame squarely on her behavior. Sandra had been happily married longer than she and Dave, and was the most open-minded person L'Oreal had ever known. Maybe that's why the condemnation in her friend's eyes hurt her so much. Sandra didn't express her opinion, but she quickly cooked a meal and made L'Oreal take a shower. She called their boss and arranged with a friend for a vacation until the end of the week. This set the pattern for the rest of the week. Sandra keeps L'Oreal alive. L'Oreal is emotionally drained, moving away step by step. Sandra offered to seek psychological help from a friend, but L'Oreal categorically refused. It was enough that her friend and the children knew what she had done. The thought of telling a complete stranger about it was disgusting. By the next weekend, Sandra realized that she needed help to support her friend. It was getting pretty depressing, and she had her own life. L'Oreal had told her enough about her conversation with her son Mark to realize that there was too much pain in it to survive it in the short term. L'Oreal's youngest daughter, Laura, went to college in another state, and she didn't have a vacation for several weeks, and Penny left for another 2 weeks on a business trip to Europe. Sandra knew that the neighbor was another friend of L'Oreal's and spoke out about her, only to hear that the neighbor was a friend of both Dave and L'Oreal, and Dave's stories about his wife's actions led to her and her husband taking sides, and L'Oreal would not like whose side they stood aside. Sandra took the opportunity to check out Dave's version, only to discover that it was a lifeless version of the one her friend had told her. Dave didn't seem to be particularly vindictive, but was just stating his point of view. Sandra couldn't blame him. Divorce polarizes relationships. The most difficult question L'Oreal asked Sandra was whether Dave would ever come back. Her friend evaded the question. She knew that Dave was an extremely loyal, but also incredibly uncompromising man. After all, she had known him for many years too. L'Oreal was well enough to return to the office next week. However, her behavior was nothing compared to normal, and she was noticeably nervous about loud noises and annoyed, especially when someone laughed loudly. For L'Oreal, these days were almost bearable. For whole minutes, she was busy enough to forget that she had thoughtlessly killed in her personal life. It was the nights that killed her. Sandra became more and more worried and upset. Her husband put pressure on her, forcing her to stay away from her friend. He condemned what L'Oreal had done to Dave and worried about the effect L'Oreal might have on his wife. Sandra had to admit that although she condemned such behavior, she felt she owed her friend some loyalty. However, the moment of making a decision was fast approaching. Sandra and her husband have booked a cruise for their second honeymoon, which starts in 2 weeks. Unwilling to give up non-refundable tickets, Sandra could only contact L'Oreal's eldest daughter, Penny, to make sure she could take care of L'Oreal while she was away. Fortunately, when the divorce papers arrived, Sandra was there for support. She took her husband with her to show him how much her friend was suffering and hoped to get at least some sympathy from him and thus reduce his pressure to distance himself from the situation. When she realized the enormity of the consequences of this simple package, L'Oreal told her friend, "I love him." Sandra's husband started saying, "Bullshit. If you loved him, you wouldn't," before his wife elbowed him, silencing him. L'Oreal knew how that phrase would end, and it tormented her that it was true. Without a doubt, L'Oreal was in deep crisis. If she had been in a rational enough state of mind to analyze this, she would have come to the conclusion that the crisis has 2 main factors. It was becoming increasingly obvious that Dave was gone forever. The fact that he must have known how much she was in pain and made no attempt to comfort her alone made it a matter of course. This meant that at some point she would have to move on. But what awaits her in the future? Of course, she is still attractive. The rugby player has at least proved that. And, according to the terms of the proposed divorce, she will be financially secure if she continues to work. No, the problem, or problems in the plural, was in love. She thought she loved her husband like no one else, and yet she betrayed him terribly, twice. This left a huge question. Did she know what true love was? If she manages to find love in her life again, will it really be love? Will she be able to deceive herself that she loves a new guy? Or will she always think that she lied to herself once and does it again? This line of her philosophizing monopolized her thoughts until Penny returned. After seeing her mother's condition, Penny resolutely decided to move in with her, but she had a fiancé she hadn't seen for a month, and she decided not to. She, however, spent as much time with her as her conscience allowed, and joined Sandra's voice in persuading her mother to find a counselor. L'Oreal's second crisis was inadvertently provoked by her eldest daughter. It was Sunday, and L'Oreal knew that Penny had been at a business awards dinner on Friday night. She saw her daughter stop in front of the house. Her house? No, her house and Dave's house. As Penny walked down the path, L'Oreal came to open the front door. Penny flinched when her mother opened the door and hurriedly hid something behind her back, and then hid it until she was inside. However, she couldn't hide the fact that it was a Sunday newspaper delivered by L'Oreal. As usual, L'Oreal hadn't slept most of the night and was annoyed. She demanded to see the newspaper, but noticed that Penny was nervous when she spread it out on the table and looked through it. She found what Penny had hoped to hide in the social section. She might have missed the full effect of the photo if Penny hadn't nudged her hand, trying her own kind of censorship. There were several photos from Friday's Business Awards dinner. No, the photo didn't show her husband accepting the award. It was just a picture of some of the visitors enjoying themselves. Dave was sitting at the table on the left, with Penny, her fiancé, and some guy L'Oreal had never seen before. What was it about this photo that alarmed her daughter so much? She looked closer. Her breathing quickened and then stopped completely when she noticed it. Dave's right hand was in the lower left corner of the photo. Another, disembodied hand rested on his forearm. An elegant, feminine hand. The gesture wasn't exactly intimate, but it was definitely possessive. L'Oreal looked at her daughter's worried face. Suddenly, Dave's actions made sense. The reason he left so quickly and completely was because he had already met her replacement. In staccato, breathless sentences, she questioned Penny about Dave's date that evening. All the while she was trying her best not to fall into the mental abyss that suddenly opened up right in front of her. Penny chose her words carefully. Yes, Sue was pretty, slim, and a few years younger than her mother. Yes, she seemed to dote on Penny's father, and yes, they weren't afraid to show the other people present that it was just the two of them. Penny was very worried when her mother fell into an almost catatonic silence. She had a pretty good idea of what was going through L'Oreal's head and automatically rushed to her father's defense. Wise beyond her years, she understood that most people judge others by their own standards. Her mother was a cheater and therefore probably believed that everyone was capable of cheating. She spoke to clarify the situation. No, her father didn't have an affair before he caught his wife with another man. She started telling L'Oreal that her father was too noble to behave like that, until she realized that it indirectly indicated that she thought of her mother, an opinion that she had great difficulty hiding. It was obvious that her words did not penetrate her mother's soul, so she fell silent. A battle was raging in L'Oreal's head. The counterpoint of most of her thoughts over the past month has been exposed. Dave obviously either dated this woman while he was living with L'Oreal, or moved in and found love very quickly. How could this happen? She would bet her life that her husband loved her with all his soul, with everything he had. The last gift and the statement, "because you are worth it," were not so long ago. His actions showed her that he still loved her. She knew she had been a little distracted by her thoughts and intrigues in the weeks leading up to that terrible night, but how blind had she been not to see that Dave had fallen out of love with her? It was a far cry from the actions of Dave, who loved her to distraction. How long had he been lying when he said she was worth it? He was so in love with her that when he found another guy in bed with her, he didn't even try to defend his honor. although he probably knew that his head would be broken. Besides, there was not the slightest hint that he had ever thought about fighting for her and their marriage. So by the time Penny called an ambulance because her mother was completely unresponsive, several terrible definitions had been reinforced in L'Oreal's head. First of all, Dave won't be coming back. Shocked by her actions, he moved on. Secondly, if Dave had an affair, it was only because she, his wife, was not enough for him. It was incredibly painful. The third thought was a very bad omen for her own future. Not only did she not know if she could convince herself that she loved someone, even when she was sure of it, but now she would forever think that she was being lied to when another man said he loved her. If her husband, with whom she had lived for many years, had deceived her so easily, then a relative stranger could say whatever he wanted. L'Oreal woke up in the psychiatric ward of the hospital, not remembering how she got there. In a way, Penny felt relieved. Now her mother had to go to a psychologist. She visited him as often as her job allowed. Her father offered to help, but experts advised that this was probably not a good move. After confirming that he did not intend to continue the marriage, he was politely asked to stay away. He forced himself to obey, even though it went against decades of instinct to come to L'Oreal's aid. L'Oreal stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks before she was discharged under antidepressants and under medical supervision. Claire, her consultant, was a stern veteran with 30 years of experience. Like all consultants, Claire had a choice that she had to make at the beginning of her career. Either take on some of the pain of your clients and risk becoming emotionally damaged yourself, or build a solid, impenetrable shell around your psyche. She chose the latter, which did not endear her to clients. Don't get me wrong, she was good. It's just a little tough sometimes. She counted the months until she could quit her job and become the loving grandmother she dreamed of becoming. Penny accompanied her mother to the first session and led most of the conversation. After L'Oreal left the room, Claire asked her daughter to be alone. L'Oreal breathed a sigh of relief. She found most of the session extremely awkward. If Penny hadn't been there, many of the details revealed would have required many sessions from the consultant to get out of her. When Penny showed up 15 minutes later, she didn't say anything, and her mother didn't ask any questions. Sitting in her office, Claire pretty much knew which of her well-tested methods to use. She emailed L'Oreal asking her to bring the family photo albums with her next time for a long session. Claire hated short sessions. The constant stop-starts were annoying. L'Oreal came to the next meeting alone, nervous, and carrying the requested albums. Claire spent less than 2 minutes looking through them. They turned out to be exactly what she expected. It took her more than 10 minutes to calm L'Oreal down, and then she asked her to describe her marriage. L'Oreal's face took on a happy expression as she described meeting Dave, his pursuit of her, his proposal, and the years they spent together. She told Claire about how Dave was constantly bringing home surprises like flowers and gifts, even about their ritual when she would say, "Oh, Dave, why are you spoiling me so much?" And his ritual response is, "Because you're worth it." About an hour into the session, Claire saw L'Oreal hesitating and suspected it was because she was subconsciously putting off talking about her cheating. Claire was good at her job and brought the session to unpleasant questions, which she knew her client was afraid of. She suggested that L'Oreal describe the end of her marriage in carefully chosen words on her part, in as much detail as was convenient for her. She was very surprised when L'Oreal did not justify herself for cheating. Most of her clients in this situation would take the opportunity to relieve themselves of the burden and get the consultant's approval. Instead, she revealed details of her first failed impromptu affair with a random guy and a more deliberate encounter with a rugby player. Claire admired L'Oreal's description of Dave's apparent emotional control during the final confrontation and correctly concluded that control, and the fact that he returned unexpectedly early, was proof that he expected what he found. After her painful confession, L'Oreal was weakened enough for Claire to effortlessly figure out exactly what L'Oreal wanted from the sessions. An answer to the question of why Dave didn't fight for her. Her ideas that she was incapable of loving and unable to understand that Dave was lying when he said he loved her were deeply buried during her stay in the hospital. Claire was interested in L'Oreal's description of the strange expression on her husband's face that night, and she suspected that she knew what caused it. But she knew that she had to explain the reason very carefully to L'Oreal or risk another breakdown. Claire asked the receptionist to bring a couple of cups of coffee while they chatted about harmless objects as a short break before turning L'Oreal's attention to a stack of photo albums. For the next half hour, L'Oreal turned the pages, giving brief explanations to some of the photographs. Claire was mentally keeping score. On the sixth page of the first album, Claire pointed to a photo of Dave and L'Oreal at a formal dinner. L'Oreal noted that the dinner was one of those evenings when her husband received an award for one of his projects, and another person at the table offered to take a picture. The photo was taken from the side, with Dave leaning out from behind L'Oreal. Claire, who knew how important it was for clients to discover things for themselves rather than point them out, tried to encourage them to self-discover. "Did you take any photos of Dave receiving the award?" "Of course I did." "So where are they?" "Oh, I didn't have room in the album to put all the photos." Claire looked pointedly at the open page. In the other 7 photos on this page, L'Oreal looked radiant. "Dave, of course, took a lot of photos of you." "Well, what are you waiting for? This is a $400 dress, a $150 hairstyle, and a $100 professional makeup. Look at me. I was beautiful. I hadn't gotten pregnant yet, so I didn't have that little tummy that I've had since." The advisor couldn't resist making an unprofessional comment. Dave must have felt very flattered that night. L'Oreal did not understand what kind of comment it was and completely misinterpreted it. Of course he would. He must have been very proud. I mean, look at all the other wives in the photos. Tasteless and boring for women. He told me as he walked in that he was proud to walk with me on his arm. I always knew I was a little out of his league, but I thought, what the hell? He was kind and generous, passably handsome, well-qualified, loved children, and obviously idolized me. What kind of woman would refuse this? L'Oreal lapsed into silence, and Claire waited, hoping that the blatantly obvious would begin to take root in the woman opposite her. Unfortunately, L'Oreal just turned the page and started looking at the photos again. When they finished the last album, Claire invited L'Oreal to talk about her own achievements in life and was not overwhelmed by the information she learned. L'Oreal studied only until the end of high school. She worked a menial job until she met Dave and married him a year and a half later. She became pregnant within a year, opposed having more than one child in order to keep as much of her body shape as possible, but succumbed to pressure and gave birth to 2 more. Since then, she has hardly left the house. She tried to find a couple of meaningful jobs after discussing that they needed a better nest egg to retire early and enjoy the standard of living they were used to, but gave up after a few blows. Her administrative volunteering for several charities was done so that she could compete at the country club. As time passed, Claire sent L'Oreal with an order to think about what they had talked about that day. L'Oreal left, glad that the session was much less painful than she had thought. On the way, L'Oreal asked Claire if she thought Dave hated her now. Claire simply replied that she should explore the opposite of love. Claire used her lunch break to do some research on Dave, and again wasn't surprised by what she found. A successful businessman who has reached all the heights in their small provincial town. His only choice was to uproot his social life with his wife and move away from their children, working more or traveling a lot to spread his network as far as possible. Before the next client, Claire considered her tactics for the next sessions with L'Oreal. She sighed. Would she have to brazenly point out that about 5% of the photos in the albums show Dave, another 30% show their children, and the rest show a smiling L'Oreal? Would she have to admit that from conversations with Penny it became clear that her daughter was immensely proud of her father and in no way condemned him for the way he treated his wife, her mother? How much of L'Oreal's condescending attitude toward her husband has Penny revealed? Such information should be carefully processed to avoid a possible permanent breakdown of her client. She was amazed at the self-deception of L'Oreal, who could not understand the expression on Dave's face the night he left for good. L'Oreal, obviously, always and to this day believed that her husband loved her. His gentle attitude towards her had strengthened her faith until that terrible night. Claire wondered how close Dave was to uncovering her deception when he sat down, looked at the balance sheet, and saw the inevitable conclusion. The conclusion that was the real reason for that mysterious half-smile that L'Oreal described. She wasn't out of his league. He was out of hers, damn it. He finally escaped. Claire couldn't help but hope that Dave's new woman appreciated him and treated him the way he deserved. Moments before her next client showed up, Claire questioned her wisdom by suggesting that L'Oreal explore the opposite of love. If she had, the knowledge would, of course, explain all of Dave's behavior since that fateful night, but it could also, potentially, be quite devastating. The opposite of love was never hate, it was indifference. L'Oreal spent the next 2 nights after the session in a flurry of nightmarish questions. Did she love Dave? How did she not notice that he didn't love her? How could he just walk away without fighting for her? Claire explored the opposite of love, but didn't understand the answers she found. Didn't understand, or didn't have the strength to accept. Finally, at 4 a.m. on the second night, she sent a message to the number she had memorized after secretly reviewing the file in Claire's office. Dave's new cell phone number. Can we meet so I can ask you a few questions? Dave, the early riser, answered immediately. I don't think Sue would like that. I'm sure if I had asked her if she minded, she would have agreed, but she wouldn't have wanted to. I don't want to put her under such pressure right now and risk what we're building. Disappointment replaced the melancholy that L'Oreal felt. You can tell her that I don't hope to get back together with you. I'm harmless and just need some answers. Again, the answer came quickly. I'm sure it's a small risk, but not one that I'm willing to take right now. Angered, L'Oreal typed the answer on her electronic keyboard. For the sake of our common years and children, why don't you take this tiny risk? This time the response came more slowly. This made her suddenly understand the research she had done the day before. He cut through her illusions like a katana through a watermelon. She realized what a self-centered bitch she really was, and that she would never experience true love in her life again. Through the rapidly growing red haze of mental collapse, she heard his answer. Because you're not worth it.